The morning they brought the horse out, every person in that courtyard took one step back. I didn't. Not because I was brave. I want to be honest about that. I stayed where I was because my legs had simply forgotten how to move, locked in place by something that wasn't courage but looked enough like it from the outside. The stallion's name was Ruin. I learned that later, from one of the stable hands who whispered it to me with the kind of expression people reserve for things they'd rather not name out loud. Ruin, black as the space between stars, and twice as cold. But I'm getting ahead of myself. To understand why I was standing in that courtyard at all, you need to understand what brought me there, and what I was running from. My name is June. I'm 24 years old, and until 3 weeks before that morning, my entire world had been the Eastern Valley Settlement, a cluster of stone buildings and shared gardens that sat at the edge of packed territory like an afterthought. I had grown up there with my mother, then without her, then with the hollow understanding that some people are simply meant to exist at the margins of things. I wasn't weak. I want to be clear about that too. I could ride. I had been riding since I was 7 years old, first on borrowed horses, and later on a pale gray mare named Oat, who tolerated me with a kind of dignified patience I've never found in a person since. But being able to ride in the Eastern Valley was not the same thing as belonging in the Northern Stronghold. The Northern Stronghold was where the Alpha King lived. His name was Leand, and if you grew up anywhere within 100 miles of packed territory, you already had an opinion about him before you'd ever seen his face. The stories were old and layered like sediment. Some of them whispered around fires, some of them told flatly in the daylight, the way people tell facts they'd rather were fiction. He was ruthless, people said. Cold. He had held the title of Alpha King for 11 years, and in those 11 years, no one had successfully challenged him, which in our world meant something very specific and very final. I had seen him once, 2 years prior, when he'd passed through the valley on what I later understood was an inspection. A word that sanitized something that felt closer to surveillance. He had ridden at the front of a formation of 7, and I remember thinking he looked like a man who had never once been uncertain about anything in his life. Dark hair, sharp jaw, the kind of stillness that predators have when they're not actively hunting. He hadn't looked at me. Why would he? The reason I ended up in his stronghold had nothing to do with ambition, and everything to do with my neighbor's goat. This is the part of the story that always makes people laugh, and I understand why. The goat, a spotted, perpetually disgruntled animal named Fen, had pushed through a gap in the shared fence for the last time. In chasing him through the eastern field that morning, I had followed him through a border marker I genuinely hadn't noticed, and onto land that technically, legally, and in every way that mattered, belonged to the king's territory. The patrol found me standing ankle-deep in mud, holding a goat by the scruff, with zero dignity and considerable grass stains on both knees. They brought me to the stronghold. I assumed they would find me, hold me overnight, send me home. They didn't. What actually happened was this. The patrol captain, a broad woman named Safa, with close-cropped silver hair and eyes that missed nothing, looked at me for a long moment in the entrance hall, and then said quietly, "You can ride." It wasn't a question. I had been on horseback when they intercepted me, and I suppose the way I'd handled the patrol's approach, turning out sideways, holding ground, not panicking, had told her something. "Yes," I said. "Well," she said, "that's unfortunate for you." She said it without cruelty, which somehow made it worse. I was assigned temporary quarters, not a cell, but not comfortable either, and told I would be summoned in the morning. I did not sleep. The stronghold at night was its own world. Through the narrow window of my room, I could hear it breathing. The distant stamp of horses, the low conversation of guards on rotation, the wind pulling at the flags on the outer wall. The outer wall was the first thing you noticed about the stronghold from a distance, and the last thing you stopped noticing up close. It was old, built from a gray stone that seemed to absorb rather than reflect light, and it rose at the western edge of the training grounds to a height that I had estimated, from the courtyard, at somewhere between 12 and 15 feet. There was a jump marker at its base. Old wood, worn smooth. The kind of marker you put in the ground and never move, because the thing it marks has never been completed. I found out the next morning what it marked. Sepha came for me at dawn. She walked me through a corridor I hadn't been through yet, out into the main training yard, where perhaps 30 people were already assembled. Riders, officials, packmates of various rank, 2 women I didn't recognize who wore the silver threading of the inner council. And at the center of it, standing with his back to me, was the Alpha King. He turned when I entered. I had been wrong 2 years ago. I had thought he looked like a man who had never been uncertain. Now, up close, I understood I'd been reading the wrong thing entirely. He didn't look certain. He looked contained. There is a difference. Uncertainty can be resolved, but something that has been contained for a long time develops pressure, and pressure is not the same as calm. June, he said. My name in his mouth was not a greeting. It was a category. Yes, I said, which was the second time in as many days that seemed to be the only word I had. He looked at me for a moment. Then he looked past me, at the stable entrance. And as if responding to something only he could hear, the doors opened, and they brought Ruin out. The horse was enormous. Not just tall, though he was tall, the tallest animal I had ever stood near, but enormous in a way that occupied space beyond his physical body, the way storms do. He moved with a contained violence, the whites of his eyes flashing, 4 handlers on leads that he ignored with complete contempt. 3 of the assembled riders stepped back. I saw one of the council women grip the fence rail. He has thrown every rider we have, Leanne said. His voice was completely level. He has thrown me. Something shifted in the yard. The word me landed differently than everything before it. I would like to see, the king continued, what you do with him. The silence that followed was the specific kind that precedes a thing becoming permanent. I understood in that moment that this wasn't about the goat. It wasn't about the trespass or the fine or the border marker. This was something else. A test whose parameters I didn't fully understand, offered to someone who had not asked to be here and had not been given the option of refusal. I looked at Ruin. He looked back at me, and in his dark eyes, I saw nothing gentle, nothing safe. Only that compressed, furious energy of a creature that had decided, a long time ago, that the world was trying to break it. I took a breath. All right, I said. And somewhere behind me, very quietly, I heard Sepha exhale. They gave me no saddle. I found this out when one of the handlers, a young man with careful hands and the look of someone who had learned caution the hard way, brought me the bridle and nothing else. I stared at it for a moment. Around me, the assembled crowd had reorganized itself instinctively, pressing back toward the fence rails with the collective body language of people who wanted a clear exit route, but were too proud to admit it. No saddle? I said, not to anyone in particular. He destroys them, the handler said quietly. His name, I would later learn, was Petter. 17 years old, the only person in the stable who still approached Ruin voluntarily, and the reason the horse had not starved during the 2 months no one else dared enter his stall. Bucks until they break. We stopped trying after the 3rd one. I looked at the bridle in my hands, plain leather, recently oiled. Someone had cared enough to do that at least. Does he take the bit? Petter hesitated. Sometimes. That was not a reassuring answer. I walked toward Ruin anyway. What I remember most about those first steps is the sound, or rather, the way the sound around me changed. The low murmur of 30 observers dropped to something closer to silence. And in that silence I became acutely aware of everything. The grit of the courtyard under my boots, the cold morning air carrying the smell of hay and damp stone, the particular quality of winter light that makes everything look like it's being seen through old glass, and Ruin, standing at the center of it all, watching me approach with an attention that was almost personal. I stopped about 4 feet away, not because I was afraid, though I was, in a low and manageable way, but because I had learned something about horses in all those years in the Eastern Valley that I suspected most of the people watching me had not. Horses do not respond to confidence the way people think they do. They don't respect bravado. What they recognize, what they orient toward, is stillness. Genuine stillness, the kind that comes from a body that has decided it is not a threat and is not threatened. It's almost impossible to fake. Animals know the difference. I stood still, and I breathed, and I let Ruin look at me. He did, for a long time. His ears moved. His weight shifted slightly back, which in a horse this wound up was meaningful. Not retreat, but reassessment. He was deciding something. I could feel the king's gaze on my back, and the councilwomen's careful attention, and the barely contained disbelief of the assembled riders. And I let all of it exist at the edge of my awareness without letting it pull me out of this moment. This 4 feet of courtyard, this conversation that had no words in it. Then I took one more step forward, slowly, and raised my hand. Ruin's nostrils flared. He held. I touched him, just below the jaw, with the flat of my palm. He didn't move. Behind me, someone made a sound that wasn't quite a word. I heard it, acknowledged it, set it aside. I stayed with my hand on Ruin's jaw, feeling the warmth of him, the tension running through his neck like a cable pulled tight. He was still deciding. I waited. It took almost 3 minutes. I know because later Sepha told me, with an expression I couldn't entirely read, that she had counted. 3 minutes of absolute stillness, of a horse and a young woman from the Eastern Valley, taking the measure of each other in front of the Alpha King's assembled court. Then Ruin lowered his head, just slightly. 1/2 inch. Maybe less. I bridled him. Mounting bareback required more athleticism than elegance, and I will not pretend otherwise. I got up on the 3rd attempt, using the fence rail as a step when it became clear that Ruin's height was going to make the 2nd attempt as unsuccessful as the 1st. There was a sound from the crowd at the 2nd attempt that I chose to interpret as sympathy rather than amusement. When I finally settled onto his back, I felt the whole of him reorganize beneath me, that coiled energy shifting, searching, not yet decided about what it wanted to do with me. I gave him a moment. Then I asked him forward. He went. Not willingly, not smoothly. The first 10 strides were a negotiation that required most of my concentration and both of my legs, and twice I felt him gather himself in a way that could have preceded a buck but didn't, and I understood that was him testing, not breaking, testing, the same way I had been testing him from the ground. We were still in the conversation. I didn't take him out of it. We circled the yard once, then again. By the 3rd circuit, something had settled between us. Not trust, not yet, but a provisional agreement. He was moving with purpose now, his head lower, his stride longer, and I felt the difference the way you feel a held breath finally released. I heard nothing from the crowd. That kind of silence has a texture to it. On the 4th circuit, I saw the wall. It was impossible to miss now from horseback. 15 feet of gray stone rising at the western edge of the yard, the old jump marker at its base worn smooth with years of disuse. A distance had been cleared in front of it, not recently I could tell, but maintained, the way you maintain something that represents an idea even when the idea has stopped being tested. I had not planned what happened next. I want to be clear about that. What I did was not calculated defiance, was not performance, was not the bold gesture of someone who had prepared for this moment. What happened was simpler and stranger than that. Ruin saw the wall, and he pulled toward it. I felt it in the shift of his weight, the slight rightward lean of his body, the way his stride lengthened with something that had nothing to do with fear. He wanted it. This horse that had thrown every rider, that had been named for destruction, that carried his trauma like armor. He wanted to jump that wall. He had always wanted to jump that wall, and no one had ever stayed on long enough to let him try. I had approximately 4 seconds to make a decision. I made it. I gave him his head, and I pressed forward and I felt the world compress into a single point of pure momentum. the thunder of his hooves accelerating across the courtyard, the cold air splitting around us, the wall growing from a detail into a certainty with terrifying speed. I had jumped walls before. Not this wall, not at this height, not on a horse I had known for 20 minutes. But I knew the shape of the thing, the geometry of it. And I trusted it, and I trusted the animal beneath me, with a completeness that had no room in it for second-guessing. We left the ground. For a moment, one suspended. Impossible moment. We were above the wall. I felt Ruin's body arc beneath me, felt the clean perfection of it, felt him extend and reach and clear the stone with a margin that I would later be told was at least 3 hands. The landing was hard and forward, and I stayed on, barely, grabbing Maine with both hands and riding the momentum out across the field on the other side, pulling him down to a canter, then a trot, then a breathing, steaming, trembling stop. I sat there for a moment in the tall grass of the outer field, listening to Ruin breathe. Then I turned him around, brought him back through the gate that Peder had run to open, and walked into the courtyard. The silence had a different quality now. I looked up. 30 faces, all turned toward me. Sefa, with both hands pressed flat on the fence rail and an expression I could not name. The councilwomen still. The riders, recalibrated. And at the center of all of it, exactly where he had been standing when I first entered, the Alpha King. Leanda was looking at me with something in his face that I had not seen there before. I didn't know what to call it yet. But I felt it settle in the air between us like a frequency, low and persistent. And I knew, with the same certainty I'd felt in the moment before the jump, that whatever came next would not be simple. They didn't send me home. I had expected, after the yard emptied and Ruin was led back to his stall by a Peder who looked at the horse with something bordering on reverence, that someone would come to my quarters with the appropriate paperwork. A fine, a release form, a formal acknowledgement that the trespass had been addressed, and I was free to return to my goat and my valley and my life at the margin of things. I sat on the narrow bed in my temporary room and waited for that knock. It didn't come. What came instead, 2 hours later, was Sifa. She stood in the doorway with her arms crossed and her silver hair catching the gray afternoon light from the corridor window. And she looked at me with that expression I still couldn't fully read. Something between assessment and something warmer that she kept carefully covered. "The king wants you to stay," she said. I stared at her. "For how long?" He didn't specify. "That's not an answer." "No," she agreed. "It isn't." She let a moment pass. "You don't have to. You're not being detained. The trespass has been considered settled," his words. I turned that over. Settled. Not forgiven, not dismissed. Settled, like a debt that had been paid in a currency no one had expected. "What would I be doing here?" I asked. Sefa's expression shifted, just slightly. "Working with Ruin. There are other horses too, the difficult ones. The ones we've run out of options for." She paused. "And whatever else he decides." That last part landed with a weight she hadn't tried to soften. Whatever else he decides. I sat with it for a moment, turning it over the way you turn over a stone to see what lives underneath. "All right," I said. It seemed to be the only word I had around these people. Sefa almost smiled. "You keep saying that." "It keeps being the situation," I said. This time she did smile, briefly, and it changed her face entirely, made her look younger, less like a wall, and more like a person who had decided a long time ago that walls were practical. She left me with a schedule, a map of the stronghold grounds, and the information that I would have dinner with the stable staff that evening, not with the court. I was glad about that. I wasn't ready for the court. The stable staff ate together in a low-ceilinged room off the main yard, at a long wooden table that had clearly hosted 10,000 meals and showed every one of them. There were 7 of them, Peder the youngest, a woman named Dalla, who managed the feed inventory with the focused intensity of someone diffusing something explosive, 2 brothers called Ren and Fen, 2, the second name provisional and apparently the source of ongoing gentle argument, an older man named Brast who spoke rarely, but always precisely, and a woman named Ori, who had been at the stronghold for 23 years and remembered when the wall jump marker had first been set in the ground. 19 attempts, Ori said, when she found out what had happened that morning. She said it the way people say numbers that have become significant over time. 19 riders, including him. She didn't say the name. She didn't need to. The marker's been there 6 years. Why does he keep it? I asked. Because he doesn't take things out of the ground until they're finished, Brast said, from the end of the table. He said it without inflection, which somehow made it the most revealing thing anyone had said about Leanda since I'd arrived. I thought about that as I lay in bed that night, listening to the stronghold settle around me. A man who kept the marker in the ground, because the thing wasn't finished yet. Who had tried 19 times and failed and kept the evidence of that failure precisely where everyone could see it, not as shame, but as a statement. I didn't know what to do with that information. I put it away carefully, the way you put away something fragile, and tried to sleep. The weeks that followed had a shape I hadn't expected. I worked with Ruin every morning, and with 3 other horses the stable considered unreachable. A young gray stallion with a fear response so severe he sweated through any approach. A mare who had developed the habit of running at fences rather than over them, and an older bay gelding who had simply, quietly, stopped responding to any human contact at all. They were 4 different problems, 4 different histories, 4 different expressions of the same essential thing. An animal that had learned the world was not safe and had organized itself accordingly. I understood that more than I expected to. The work was physical and slow, and sometimes discouraging in the specific way that work with living things always is, because living things don't progress in straight lines. They go forward and sideways and occasionally backward, and you have to hold the whole shape of the progress in your head rather than any individual day, or the bad days will convince you nothing is working. I had learned this with horses in the valley. I applied it here. What I hadn't expected was the watching. Leanda came to the training yard most mornings. Not always. Not predictably. But often enough that after the first week I had stopped being surprised by his presence at the fence rail, standing with that contained stillness of his, watching without commenting. He never interfered. He never offered instruction. He arrived, he observed, he left, and I had no framework for understanding what the observation meant. I asked Sifa about it at the end of the second week. She looked at me for a moment before answering, with that careful quality she had. He watches everything that interests him, she said finally. And things that don't interest him? He doesn't watch those, she said. That was, again, not quite an answer. But it was something. The first time he spoke to me directly, not in the courtyard challenge, not in the formal yes or no of my first morning, but actually spoke, the way people speak when they're not performing a role, was on a Tuesday, 23 days after I'd arrived. I know it was a Tuesday because Dalla always made a particular kind of bread on Tuesdays, and I had been looking forward to it, which tells you something about how quickly the stronghold had started to feel like a place where I had routines. I was working with the gray stallion, whose name was Crest, in the smaller of the 2 training rings. We had made real progress that week. He was allowing me to approach from the right side now, which had taken 11 days of patient work and several setbacks. I was focused, and I didn't hear Leanda come in. "What did you do differently today?" he said. I startled. Crest startled too, throwing his head, and I placed my hand flat on his neck and waited for him to resettle before I turned around. Leanda was standing at the ring gate, not leaning. He never seemed to lean on anything, as though contact with surfaces was something he decided was optional. He was looking at Crest, not at me. "I came from the left instead of the right," I said, when Crest had calmed. "For the first 9 days. He has an old injury on his left shoulder, I think. Not active, but the memory of it. Coming from the right meant he never had to show me the side he'd learned to protect." Leanda was quiet for a moment. "And today?" Today he let me stand on the left, so I came from there first, to show him it was safe, then from the right. I paused. The right side being easy is only useful if he knows the difficult side is also survivable. Another silence, longer than the first. That's not in any training manual I've seen, he said. I didn't learn from manuals, I said. He looked at me then, directly, and I held it. In the 3 weeks I'd been here, I had learned that looking away from Leand was interpreted as something, submission or discomfort, either of which he seemed to find less interesting than their opposite. I didn't look away. Where did you learn? He asked. From the horses, I said, and from being the thing that needed to be approached carefully. The words came out before I'd decided to say them. I felt them land in the space between us and considered, for a brief panicked moment, taking them back. I didn't. Leanda looked at me for a long moment. Something moved in his expression. Not the contained stillness I was used to, but something beneath it. A shift, like pressure finding a hairline crack. Dinner, he said. Tonight, not with the stable staff. He left before I could answer. Behind me, Crest pressed his nose gently against my shoulder, and I stood there in the early afternoon light with the word dinner sitting in my chest like something that hadn't decided yet what it wanted to be. The dining room where Leanda received guests was nothing like the long wooden table in the stable staff room, and everything like what I had expected from a man who kept failure markers in the ground as a matter of principle. It was large without being cavernous, lit by iron fixtures that held real candles, rather than the electric fittings in the rest of the stronghold. A choice I understood immediately, not an oversight. The table was set for 2, which told me the invitation had been decided before he came to the training ring that afternoon, which told me something else entirely. A servant I hadn't met showed me to my seat without comment, and disappeared with the particular skill of someone trained to be invisible. I was wearing the best thing I had, which was not very good. I was aware of this. I was also aware that being aware of it was the most I could do about it, so I sat down and arranged my face into something I hoped looked like a person who dined with Alpha Kings regularly enough to be relaxed about it. Leandi arrived 4 minutes later. He sat down across from me, poured his own water, and looked at me. "You're uncomfortable," he said. "You're very direct," I said. "Yes," he said. "Is that a problem?" "No," I said. "I prefer it." Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, but the architecture of one, the structure beneath the surface. He passed me the water. The dinner was not what I'd expected. I had prepared myself for formality, for the stiff choreography of a meal that was really an evaluation, with every question a test and every answer a data point. What I got instead was something closer to a conversation, which was both better and more disorienting, because I knew how to navigate tests, but genuine interest was harder to account for. He asked about the Eastern Valley, not in a surveying way, not the questions of a king taking inventory of territory, but with the attention of someone who had spent a long time in one place and was genuinely curious about others. I told him about the settlement, the shared gardens, the particular social architecture of a community that was technically within pack territory, but had always existed at a slight remove from its structures. I told him about Oat, my gray mare, and watched something flicker in his face at the name. "You left her there," he said. "She's being looked after," I said. Dalla's cousin arranged it. I paused. I checked. "I didn't say you hadn't." "Your face did." This time the not-quite smile was closer to the surface. "I'm told my face is difficult to read." "It's not that difficult," I said, and then immediately wondered if I'd overstepped, but he didn't look offended. He looked, if anything, more present, the way people look when someone says something that lands accurately. "What does it say now?" he asked. I looked at him for a moment. Across the candlelit table, in the room that was large and quiet, and felt nothing like a court, he was watching me with that attention I had come to recognize from the fence rail. Total, unhurried, with nothing performed about it. He was actually asking. Curious, I said, and careful, like someone who's interested in something but hasn't decided yet if it's safe to be. The silence that followed was long enough that I started to regret the honesty. Then he said quietly, "That's accurate." We sat with that for a moment. Outside, the wind had picked up. I could hear it moving through the courtyard, find the gaps in the old stone and make sounds in them. And the candles between us stirred slightly without going out. "Tell me about the wall," I said. His hands, which had been resting easy on the table, went still. Not tense, still. The difference mattered. "What about it?" 19 attempts, I said. 6 years. The marker's still in the ground. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Who told you 19? "Ori." A small exhale. "Of course." He looked at the table for a moment, then back at me. It became something I couldn't approach correctly. Every attempt after the 5th one was already carrying the weight of the ones before it. By the 19th, I was jumping the history more than the wall. He paused. "That's not something I've said out loud before." "I understand it," I said. "The horse remembers every bad approach. So does the rider. Eventually the jump is impossible, not because of the height, but because of everything attached to it." He looked at me. "And you weren't carrying anything when you jumped it." "I was carrying plenty," I said. "I just didn't know the wall yet. I hadn't had time to be afraid of it specifically." Something passed over his face at that. Complex. Layered. The kind of expression that belongs to a thought that has several components, and isn't sure which one to lead with. He didn't say what he was thinking. But he didn't look away. I started attending the morning briefings in the 3rd week. This was Sefa's doing, not mine. She appeared at my door on a Wednesday and informed me, without particular ceremony, that my presence had been requested in the main hall at 7. When I asked why, she said the word advisory, which could have meant many things, and probably meant all of them. The court was 15 people, not counting Leand. They ranged from a compact, precise man named Edvar, who handled territory logistics and spoke in numbered points, to an older woman named Counselor Bresch, who had been advising Alpha Kings for 30 years, and wore that history like a second coat. There were 2 younger council members close to my age, a man named Ivo, who seemed to operate primarily on opinions, and a woman named Kala, who seemed to operate primarily on facts, and the friction between them was the conversational weather of every meeting. I didn't speak at the first briefing. I sat against the wall where Sefa had placed a chair for me, and I listened and I mapped the room, the alliances, the tensions, the way certain names caused certain people to adjust their posture, the questions nobody was asking directly, but that lived in the space between every careful statement. There was a problem. I could see it by the 2nd meeting, and name it by the 3rd. 3 settlements in the Western Reach, further from the stronghold than the Eastern Valley, more isolated, with less reliable pack contact, had stopped responding to standard communications. Not hostile silence. Absence. The kind that meant either infrastructure failure or something more concerning, and no one in the room wanted to say the second option out loud. "We should send a rider," Ivo said, at the 3rd meeting. "We've sent 2, Kala said, without looking at him. "A formal delegation, then." "A formal delegation signals that we believe something is wrong," Counselor Bresch said, "which changes the nature of whatever we find when we get there." The room went quiet in that particular way it did, when a problem had been turned over enough times that everyone had seen all its faces, and no one had a solution. I said, without having entirely planned to, "Send me." Every head in the room turned. I kept my eyes on Leanda, who was at the head of the table and had, until that moment, been listening in that still way of his. He was looking at me now with full attention. "I'm not part of the formal structure," I said. "I have no rank that signals anything. I come from a valley settlement. I know how to talk to people who exist at a remove from the center. And I've been on horseback my whole life." I paused. "I'm the least threatening version of an answer you can send." The silence had a different texture now, calculating rather than surprised. It was Counselor Bresch who spoke first. "She's not wrong," she said, with the tone of someone who found this mildly annoying. Calla had already pulled a map toward her. Ivo was frowning at the table, which I would come to understand meant he was thinking, rather than objecting. Leanda had not looked away from me. "You'd go alone," he said. "Sefa," I said, "and Peder, if he wants to come." Small enough to arrive without announcement. Another silence. Outside, I could hear the wind in the courtyard, and without meaning to, I thought of the moment before the jump. That compression of everything into one point of clarity. "When would you leave?" he said. "Tomorrow," I said, "before the weather turns." He looked at me for a long moment. That something I had first seen in his face in the courtyard, the thing I hadn't been able to name, was there again, closer to the surface now. I understood it a little better by this point. It wasn't quite admiration. It was recognition. The specific expression of someone who sees a thing in another person that they understand from the inside. "Tomorrow," he said. I left the meeting with Sefa's hand briefly on my shoulder, Calla already marking the route, and the sensation, unfamiliar and a little frightening, of having been placed at the center of something rather than its edge. The western reach smelled like rain and old wood, and something underneath both of those things that I couldn't name until the second day of riding, when Sefa pulled her horse alongside mine and said quietly, "Someone's been through here recently. Not Pack." I had smelled it too. That was what I hadn't been able to name. We rode in silence for a while after that. Peder behind us on a steady chestnut mare he'd chosen himself, young enough to be nervous and experienced enough to keep it contained. The landscape out here was different from the Eastern Valley. Older, somehow. The tree lines denser. The roads less maintained. The distance between settlements measurable not just in miles, but in a particular quality of quiet that accumulates in places where people have learned to keep to themselves. The first settlement was called Marin's Cross. 12 families, a shared well, a meeting hall with a caved-in corner that had been waiting for repair for what looked like several seasons. We rode in just before noon, and the people came out slowly. Not afraid exactly, but with the careful posture of those who have learned that arrivals usually mean demands. I got off my horse and I left it standing, and I walked toward them without the formal identification, without the pack insignia, without any of the apparatus of authority. Just a woman in traveling clothes who needed to know if everyone was all right. An older man came forward first, gray at the temples, a hand that had been broken and set slightly wrong, eyes that had spent decades weighing people, and were doing it now. His name was Tomas. "You're from the stronghold," he said. Not a question. "Yes," I said. "But I'm not here officially. I'm here because you went quiet and someone was concerned." He looked at me for a long time. Then he looked past me at Sefa, who had stayed on her horse, and at Peder, who was pretending to check his saddlebag with the focused innocence of someone trying very hard not to exist. "Come inside," Tomas said. What had happened to the 3 settlements was not dramatic in the way the council's silence about it had implied. It was quieter than that, and in some ways worse for being quiet. A group of outsiders, not pack, not any recognized structure, operating in that ungoverned space between territories that exists wherever authority has edges, had been moving through the Western Reach for 2 months. They weren't violent, exactly. They were extractive. They came with offers that were really ultimatums dressed in the language of commerce, and they had correctly identified that the Western settlements were far enough from the stronghold that formal help felt theoretical. They had taken feed stores from 2 of the 3 settlements. Not all of them. Enough. The specific amount that says we can do more. The second settlement, a place called Dun Hollow, had a woman named Risa who had kept records. She handed me a folded paper with the careful manner of someone entrusting a thing they weren't sure would be received properly, and I took it with both hands and read it in front of her so she could see that I was reading it. Names, dates, quantities, descriptions. The kind of evidence that becomes powerful only when it reaches somewhere it can be used. "This is exactly what's needed," I told her. She looked at me with the expression I had come to recognize in the Eastern Valley. The expression of someone who has asked for help before and learned not to expect it, processing the unfamiliar sensation of being taken seriously. "We didn't know if anyone would come," she said. "Someone was paying attention," I said. We stayed 2 nights in the Western Reach, long enough to visit all 3 settlements, to collect what information existed, to leave people with the clear and specific message that the silence had been noticed and the problem had been received. Not a promise of immediate resolution. I wasn't in a position to make promises, but the thing that sometimes matters more than promises: acknowledgement. The confirmation that you are not as invisible as you feared. On the 3rd morning, we turned east and rode hard, and I carried Risa's paper inside my coat the whole way back. The stronghold looked different when I returned to it. Not physically. The gray stone was exactly as I'd left it, the flags on the outer wall catching the same cold wind, the smell of the stable yard reaching me before the gates did. But something in my relationship to the place had shifted. The way the relationship between a person and a space shifts when they have left it and come back. It had become, in the 11 days I'd been gone, somewhere I was returning to, rather than somewhere I was being held. Leand was in the main courtyard when we rode in. He had not been waiting. Or rather, he had been doing other things and happened to be there, which is the version of waiting that people with dignity resort to. He looked at me when I dismounted, and I looked back at him. And neither of us said anything for a moment while Pedder took the horses, and Sepha did the thing she was very good at, which was becoming invisible when the situation called for it. I took Risa's paper from inside my coat and held it out to him. He took it, read it, standing there in the courtyard, in less time than it had taken me to read it because he read the way he did everything, with complete attention and no excess motion. When he finished, he looked up. "Are they all right?" he said. The question came before the tactical one, before the "what do we do about this?" and I registered that order carefully. "They will be," I said. They needed to know the distance wasn't permanent. He was quiet for a moment, the paper in his hand, the wind moving between us. "You were right," he said. "That you were the least threatening version of an answer." "I know," I said. Something almost crossed into a smile. "You're remarkably comfortable saying that." "I'm comfortable with things that are true," I said. We stood there in the fading afternoon, in the courtyard where all of this had started. The challenge, the horse, the wall, the beginning of something that neither of us had named yet, but that had been accumulating like weather, slow and inevitable, and finally, now, present. "June," he said. The way he said my name was different from the first time, in this same courtyard, when it had been a category. Now it was something else. A door opening from the inside. "I know," I said again, softly, and watched his face do the thing it did when something accurate landed. That shift, that hairline crack in the containment, that glimpse of the person underneath the king. He reached out and took my hand, not urgently, not as a declaration, but with the careful deliberateness of a man who does not do things he doesn't mean. The outsiders in the Western Reach were handled within a month. Edvar managed it through the formal channels with the efficiency he brought to everything, armed with Risa's documented evidence and the Council's unanimous agreement that the situation required resolution. The 3 settlements received material support for the feed stores that had been taken, and a communication line was established. A regular rider, once a fortnight, so that the distance could never again become silence. Thomas sent a letter. I read it at the long stable table with Ori leaning over my shoulder, unashamed. He wrote that Marin's Cross had held a meeting and voted to formally enter Pact territory, not as subjects, but as members. The distinction mattered to them. Leanda accepted it on exactly those terms. Crest, the gray stallion, was ridden by a 12-year-old girl from the settlement school 3 months later, his first rider. She had the particular fearlessness of children who have not yet learned what to be afraid of, and he carried her around the training ring with an expression of dignified tolerance that made Pedder cry, which he denied. The bay gelding, the one who had gone quiet, was never ridden again, by choice. He lived in the south pasture for 7 more years, and was well. Ruin ran free on the eastern field every morning, which was Peter's idea, and which turned out to be the thing that completed him. He still would not allow most riders. He allowed me, and occasionally Leand, on the days when Leand came to the field in the early light, without the apparatus of rank, and simply stood by the fence and waited. Ruin always came to him eventually. Some things take the time they take. The jump marker was removed from the ground on a Tuesday in early spring. Not with ceremony, Leanda pulled it up himself, quietly, after the morning briefing, and set it aside. I was watching from the fence. He looked over at me, and I looked back at him, and we didn't need to say what it meant. The wall was still there. It always would be. But it had been cleared, and the evidence of its clearing lived in the memory of everyone who had been in that courtyard, and in the changed thing between a king who had learned that containment is not the same as strength, and a woman from the Eastern Valley who had always known that the approach matters more than the obstacle. I stayed, not because I had to, not because I had been claimed or chosen in the formal structures of a world that had its own rules about such things, though those things came too, in time, with the particular quiet dignity that Leanda brought to everything he meant. I stayed because the stronghold had become, without my entirely planning it, the place where I was most fully myself. Where the thing that had always made me strange, the stillness, the patience, the instinct for the approach rather than the force, turned out to be not a defect, but a fluency. A language the place had been waiting for someone to speak. And on the mornings when I stood in the eastern field with the wind in my hair and Ruin's warm weight beside me, the old gray wall behind us, and the whole of the territory stretching ahead, I understood, with a completeness that had nothing left to prove, that I had not jumped that wall to show anyone what I could do. I had jumped it because Ruin wanted to, and I had trusted him, and we had cleared it together. That was the whole of it. That was enough.